Hello, and welcome to part 1 of a series of reviews of all the episodes of the first 2 seasons of Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends. Your first question is probably, why am I bothering reviewing a children's show about talking steam engines? Well, it's a childhood favourite of mine, and I always enjoy talking about the things I love, so why not? The second question will probably be, why just the first 2 seasons? Well, they're the seasons that I'm the most familiar with, due to having seen the episodes over and over and over again on VHS as a kid. And they're the ones that I have the most experience with. Also, I'm notoriously bad at starting projects and not sticking to them, so I figured the first 2 seasons at least would be a bit more of a reasonable goal for me. I'll hopefully get around to season 3 and 5 later on, but we'll cross that bridge when it comes to it. And with that introduction out of the way, let's move on to a brief bit of history regarding the show and where it came from. Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends is a live-action adaptation of the Reverend Wilbert Awdry's Railway series books, which chronicles the events of an expansive cast of characters on the fictional island of Sodor, featuring many steam trains, vehicles, humans and more. After an attempt at a TV adaptation in the 1950s backfired, it wouldn't be until about 30 years later, in 1984, when audiences would finally get another look at the stories brought to the screen. Produced by Britt Allcroft, directed by David Mitton, and constructed by a whole crew of extremely talented individuals, Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends will go on to be a smash hit that will get shunted firmly into the hearts of millions of fans worldwide, many of whom would still retain that love well into adulthood years later. Despite being, a kids show, the stories are well written, with lots of banter between characters, amusing one-liners, heartfelt moments, real dangerous situations, and moral lessons that are conveyed in such a way that doesn't treat the audience like babies. I want to again stress that this is still a kids show, and I probably sound ridiculous talking about it in such a way, but I believe it's important to note these points because it's such a sharp contrast with how the show does things in the later seasons. Seriously, when people think of Thomas and say it as a baby show, they're most likely thinking of how it is later on. I mean, the contrast is real. In addition to the writing, the show's production quality on the whole is just excellent, with the crew firing on all cylinders, to provide a viewing experience that's just wonderful to see and hear. The engines, rolling stock and human characters are all finely crafted models. The engines are individually crafted faceplates that are stuck to custom built bodies, overlaid over already existing chassis. There's a lot of technical stuff I could go into there, but I don't really think that's needed here. Each engine's design gives them a distinct appearance and personality, which makes it easier for the kids to tell apart. The backgrounds and sets are especially beautiful and diverse, which really pulls the audience in and sells Sodor to you as this living, breathing world. There's stations, castles, beaches, mines, scrapyards, and much more. The music, composed by Mike O'Donnell and Junior Campbell, has a very distinctive, synthy flavour to it in the first 2 seasons, which instantly makes them stand out from the rest. Some of these tracks are real earworms, and as a personal preference, I actually prefer this quite science-y, synthy sound of it over the more orchestral soundtracks of season 3 onwards. I still really enjoy some of the later soundtracks, like some of them are really good, but as a general preference, I prefer these ones. Aside from the obvious nostalgia, I like to think that everything I previously mentioned is one of the big reasons why the classic seasons were, and still are, so appealing to fans. If you're not too keen on the stories and writing, then you can still appreciate the fantastic model work on display, and sheer amount of effort that went into making these episodes, and also vice versa. This was a show that was definitely aimed at the younger audience, but not in a way that would alienate or put off older fans by any sort of babyish hand-holding, or super on-the-nose messages and morals. Basically, it's a show that can be enjoyed by anyone. Anyway, there's the intro out of the way. Now, going on, this is just going to be a series of reviews of each episode of the first 2 series, in what's known as the Classic Series. I'm going to be talking about what I liked and disliked, as well as pointing out little tidbits along the way. Some of the things I say may be things you yourself disagree with, but that's perfectly fine. Now, I can finally start talking about the episode itself. Thomas and Gordon. The very first thing we see is Thomas himself, with the instantly recognisable voice of Ringo Starr describing our hero to us. I already pointed out that the models on the show here are wonderfully crafted, and watching the show in high definition just makes them shine even more. This does mean that the marks and dust and any other specks on them are a lot more visible, which could be seen as a negative, but if you're so inclined, you could just tell yourself that it's the wear and tear of their work on the railways. You know, just a little bit more immersion. It's here that we get our first look at the sorts of sets we can expect to witness throughout the series, and I must admit that as a child, the Knapford town background used to look absolutely huge to me. All those buildings and the church and everything like that, it looked massive. Obviously now you can tell it's not that big, but again, I was a child. This just shows how the production can ignite the imagination, and it would be far from the only time this show did such a thing. The big station is also an awesome set, with lots of engines coming and going and passengers milling about. The story is about Thomas, a cheeky little tank engine, who enjoys playing tricks on the other engines, especially the large and proud Gordon. I would hesitate to call him an antagonist, but Gordon is definitely the character who has the most grievances with the other characters throughout the first season, and I'd consider him the co-lead with Thomas. One day, Gordon decides he's just had enough of Thomas's antics, and decides to teach him a lesson by essentially just dragging him along at the end of his train for presumably miles on end. At the end of the ordeal, Gordon is satisfied, and Thomas is exhausted, having learned his lesson, and knows not to wind Gordon up again. The episode ends on a sombre note, with the little blue tank engine travelling home across the viaduct at sunset, with a sorrowful song playing, knowing not to do it again.
He just puffed slowly away to rest, and had a long, long drink. He went home very slowly, and was careful afterwards never to be cheeky to Gordon again.
Throughout the episode, we catch glimpses of other engines going about their business, which already does a great job at establishing this as a busy, working railway. We don't know their names yet. I mean, we do, but, for the purposes of this, we don't. But we will soon. For a kids' show about a talking steam locomotive, having the very first episode be about the titular character acting like a brat and getting his comeuppance was quite an admirable move in my opinion. This is easily one of the early season's greatest strengths, I think, showing that these are flawed characters who don't always do the right thing and will get their comeuppance for it. One thing I noticed while rewatching Season 1 for these reviews was that it has a quirk of lots of quiet scenes, with little ditties and SFX sprinkled here and there, which gives it a sort of eerie, more grounded feel than the later seasons, which usually always has some sort of background music playing. Here's an example of what I mean. It's really hard to explain, but it's kind of creepy, isn't it? Also, the scene where Gordon wakes up, right here, I'm not really sure if there's supposed to be some transition of time between Thomas doing his thing and waking Gordon up, but seeing all the models move around like that is quite amusing. It's one of those things that you probably wouldn't notice as a kid, but then you do when you're older. The environments on show in the first episodes are pleasant to look at, with the station and viaduct being personal favourites. Seriously, this is some impressive production work. Each one of these areas is a section of a set that would essentially be built, have all the scenes filmed in it, and then disassembled for more scenes to be filmed. I would have loved to have seen this being filmed in the day. It would have been magical. Although, this is just the beginning, but after a few more episodes, it'll become readily obvious that the overall look for Season 1 is quite unique. Get used to seeing lots of greys, blues and greens, because this series has a lot of it. It's mostly just fields with different things contained within them, like a tunnel. If you're an avid hater of fields, then Series 1 will be an absolute nightmare for you. I'll give them credit for the work, as it is their first run and haven't found their stride yet, but a lot of the sets here feel quite oddly spacious, with lots of unused space around the areas which are the main focus. It's really difficult for me to accurately describe in words, but coupled with the aforementioned scenes that have a lack of music, a lot of Series 1 has this oddly lonely and serene atmosphere to it, which really does help it carve out its own unique niche. I still really like it, it's just a different vibe almost. I really do like the final shot of Thomas crossing the bridge at sunset though. As a first episode, Thomas and Gordon does a good job of establishing two of the leads, teasing the audience with glimpses of the rest of the cast, showcasing the production work, and just being a lovely introduction to the island of Sodor. As a story, I don't think it's really that interesting or exciting when compared to some of the other ones from the series, but I'm willing to be a bit more lenient on them here since it's their first go. I love how the very first episode involves the protagonist getting his just desserts for messing around, and the message is very clear. Don't go around causing trouble if you can't handle payback. I think. Please look forward to the next review, Edward and Gordon. Thank you. When I've done all the episodes of this season, I'm probably going to lump them in together for a sort of omnibus episode, so look forward to that. For more Thomas retrospectives and reviews, I recommend checking out Usual Bloke Luke, The Unlucky Tug, and Thomas the Small Engine, and many more. Thank you.